would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold it against me. Welcome to it, folks. I tell you, I don't know what the disease is that's floating around, but this is the third week I've had to at least wrestle with it a little bit. I know some other folks who are going through the same thing, so there's clearly something going around and just refuses to let go. Comes back in waves. But I'm back in the saddle today, so at least there's that good news. We're going to do a little talking about acquiring lots today. I thought that would be interesting. I've got a little hands-on experience with that, and there was an interesting article that came out from USNews. To sort of give you a heads up, I thought I'd run through their list and maybe slather on a little Rebel Broker mojo on the top and see if we can't give you even better information on potentially buying lots. Before we do, though, a couple other little news items I wanted to hit before we jumped into that. I think it's getting more and more important as the weeks move on that we at least spend a little bit of time talking about interest rates, just because the mobility of the interest rates right now is getting more interesting. We had a solid several weeks where they went down, then we had several days where they went up, and then we had several days when they went down again. And now they're up, and they're up by numbers that are more interesting, or at least worth more of our attention. Now, the change just from yesterday, it was actually kind of interesting. The changes we've been marking when we've been going through and we've been taking a look at what these changes have been. It's been a 0.01 change, a 0.02 change up and down. So sort of just bouncing around a little bit. But we actually saw a 0.04 increase since yesterday. So today it's currently, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage is currently sitting at 4.24%. And yesterday it was at 4.2%. And it's 0.4 up, almost 0.04 up, almost across the board. The 15-year fixed rate mortgage is currently at 3.44. It was at 3.40, so that's also up 0.04. The FHA 30-year fixed loan is at 3.75, and that's unchanged. The jumbo 30-year fixed is at 4.35. Yesterday it was at 4.31, so that's up 0.04. The 5/1 adjustable rate mortgage is lagging behind in terms of how much it went up. It's currently at 3.07. It was 3.04 yesterday, so it was up 0.03. The jumbo is actually hovering right up at its 52-week high of 4.4. So that one, in terms of just past performance, comparing it to where we've seen it over the past 52 weeks, is nearest its highest point. So interesting stuff to keep your eyes on. Going to be interesting. Then the reason I pause here is because the Fed is going to be coming up in March with another meeting to decide whether or not they raise the prime rate, their rate. And I was estimating that they were not going to do that they would talk a lot about raising rates, that there would be a lot of noise made about it. But because we also saw last time that there was kind of shifting in the opinions of the members of the board, that it might be a possibility. I think it's more a possibility now than it was the last time we talked about this subject, primarily because of what's been going on with the stock market. The stock market's absolutely gone nuts. One reason why the Fed has not raised interest rates is because of the negative effect that raising interest rates has on the stock market. And I think there might be a part of their brain that says, you know what, the stock market's doing so well right now, it could drop by a bit. and not cause a whole lot of ruckus because it's trading over 20,000, right? I mean, we're hitting these benchmarks, these amazing milestones for the stock market. Everyone's talking about how Apple has now reached its new previous peak and all these other great things. So the perception might be there that a lot of the things that they've done to preserve the value in the stock market aren't as necessary as they once were. So I think there's more comfort there in that. Now, of course, as we try to point out here, it's not a really one-to-one relationship between what the Fed does in terms of interest rates and what you end up paying as a borrower on a mortgage. What is more interesting is the 10-year Treasury. You want to pay attention to what the 10-year Treasury is doing. Now, if you take a look at the 10-year Treasuries, you'll see a pretty clear representation of why we've seen increases in the mortgage rates recently. 10-year Treasuries have been going up, and in terms of trying to get a handle of what direction interest rates are going to go for a mortgage, you're much better off looking at 10-year Treasuries than anything else. So we'll see how that goes. Right now, if you look at the last 3 months in terms of 10-year Treasuries, we're actually not at a ridiculous level. It's currently at 2.43%, and it's from February 7th, it was at 2.4, so it's gone up to 2.43, but that was after it was much higher. And the relationship you're looking for is just the general direction, right? It's not a correlation. You should be expecting to pay 2% on your mortgage if 10-year Treasuries are 2%, for instance, right? If it's just the direction it's going. And then again, there's a correlation between that period of time when we saw things going down with Treasuries and we saw interest rates continue to go down. So what do we expect? This is an opportunity for us to look at some of these numbers and try to figure out what will happen. My guess is that if we continue to look at the Treasury note and the Treasury note numbers continue to look like they are trending upward, we may see some continuing increase in interest rate for mortgages. I don't think that would be an unrealistic expectation given that the chart I'm looking at, assuming the trend continues. What's going to be interesting is the introduction of a potentially concerning move by the Fed when they raise interest rates in March, if they raise interest rates in March. I would say that there's actually a fairly decent chance that they do, in fact, raise interest rates in March. It would probably be, again, a 0.25 basis point thing or a 20 basis point thing or a quarter of a percentage point. And then that'll have the same effect it had last time. And remember, one is an emotional thing and one is a numbers thing. Whenever the Fed does something like this, for whatever reason, in the following days and sometimes a week or 2 weeks, there's a freak out period where for no real explainable reason, aside from just uncertainty, the interest rate tends to go a little bit nuts. And we've seen this every time this has happened in the past. And granted, it's only happened twice in the last couple of years in terms of the Fed raising rates. We've seen this increase in lending rates, and then things have calmed down and interest rates have tended to go down. Here's where I'm going to give you a but to that. Previously, we were seeing, when we were going through these other increases, I was watching the 10-year Treasury note rate. And if I didn't see that going up, I wasn't really going to expect increases after the Fed announced an increase to stick. I said that here on this show, and I ended up being right. If we see a continuing increase in the 10-year Treasury rate numbers when they announce their percentage increase, what they're going to increase it, if we continue to see the Treasury increase, what I would expect to see is a increase in the lending rate strictly out of the emotional side of it, strictly out of the, oh my God, the Fed raised the rate side of it. And then things will calm down unless the Treasury rate, the 10-year Treasury note rate, continues to go up. Because then it would sort of push up to the point where the emotional response took us in terms of interest rates. So just make sure to keep an eye on that. This is one of those situations where those two things may cross, where we see the 10-year Treasuries continuing to go up, which would indicate that we may not see as much as a post-announcement drop-off after that initial increase that's more emotion-based. So we'll see. Of course, I'll keep an eye on it. The announcement isn't going to happen until next month, but we'll kind of calibrate to that. If not, though, if we start to see treasuries flatten in the coming days or the coming leading up to the March announcement, then if you're someone who's looking to buy, my suggestion would be to not necessarily lock in right after an increase is announced. If you find yourself in that position where that's where you are. If it was me making the decision for myself, I'm not going to tell you what to do because it's all up to you, right? But I know if I was in that boat and I saw flat or declining 10-year treasury numbers and I saw a increase in the mortgage lending rate that was going the opposite direction, obviously, from the trend of the 10-year treasury, and it was based on the fact the Fed just increased rates, I'd hold off on for a few days to see what happens with interest rates, because it wouldn't surprise me if they end up going back down a little bit. And after having said all that, the numbers we're talking about here are relatively small, 0.02, 0.03, 0.04 at the worst so far in terms of change from yesterday to today. So I don't think any of those should be things that stop you from making a decision to move forward with a purchase in any case. But if you're one of those folks who wants to try to make that bet, try to play those numbers, those are the things you should look at for you to make an informed decision. But ultimately it comes down to what makes you the most comfortable. And I know some folks would rather just lock in. They don't want to worry about it. They don't want to fuss. So feel free to take that for what it's worth for you and move forward. Okay. So we've covered that. These discussions are going to become more important as we find ourselves in a position where interest rate has more of an effect on decisions of what kind of a purchase you make. I don't think we're there yet. I've often talked about once we really get over 4.5% for a fixed rate mortgage for 30 years, I think that's when that decision starts to be more important. I think that once we creep up on 5, and in my head, I can't help thinking that 5% is that magic number where folks just sort of go, oh my God, if we don't buy now, we may end up paying 6%. If it could go up to this, what'll it go up to next? Remember, we've talked about that emotional link to a number. At what point do people start to panic and decide I need to buy now? The scary thing about that is that panic is what also feeds increasing prices. And one thing this market does not need is increasing prices based on kind of a hysterical response to a change in numbers. So so the reason I'm focusing on this, and maybe it sounds like I'm beating this to death, is I think we're seeing several different things crossing over at the same time that could potentially create a crazy market. And I'm hoping to at least give you some warning if I start to see it happening. I'm seeing elements that make me think it's a good idea to do this, to check in regularly and verify where things are in terms of the craziness level, because it just feels like we may be getting there at some point soon. So stay tuned, buckle your seatbelt. We'll all go on this ride together and see what happens at the end. For right now, we're going to take a really quick break, and we'll be back in a second with an update on what's going on with appraisals and a chat about buying lots. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right. Aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909. Welcome back, everyone. I sort of kicked the show off with some discussions about interest rates, since we're getting to that point where I think it's going to play a bigger and bigger part in folks' at least discussions about what they're going to do next. I don't think we're to the point yet where anyone's hitting panic buttons, But I think it's a good idea to remind everybody with the influence of 10-year treasuries, the influence of changes by the Fed, the emotional side of it versus the numbers side of it, and what tends to happen and what we've seen happen the last few times that interest rates have been raised by the Fed. So just kind of keep these things in mind. The person who remains calm when these things go nuts is the one who wins. It's the folks who go nuts and let these things drive them into a frenzy that are going to suffer the most under these circumstances. And my hope is that none of you are one of the frenzy people, because that never ends well for the folks who get caught up in that stuff. All right. Another little tidbit of data that I wanted to cover, which I think continues to reinforce a little bit of a split between seller expectations and what the real world is supporting. Again, another element that indicates to me we're kind of in a bit of a transition. We've talked a lot about different numbers that kind of point to we're in a transitionary period. Is this appraisal lag? Now, if you'll remember, it was probably in June or July last year, which was the last time where we talked about these numbers, and the result was that sellers were actually underestimating the value of their homes. For anyone who's been listening to a long time, it's been a while. We've talked about this particular set of numbers a few times since then, but that was really the last time where a seller went out and thought they should get $500,000 for their home, and it ended up appraising for $500 or $510 or $520. What's interesting about that is that all of the results of this type of research since then has indicated that the gap between what homeowners think their home is worth and what appraisers think their home is worth has gotten wider, but in the direction of sellers being too high. According to Quicken Loans National Home Price Perception Index, it showed that the average appraisal value was 1.47% below that of what owners expected in January. Appraisal value stayed mostly flat, slipping only 0.34% last month, according to Quicken Loans. Appraised values continue to rise, increasing 3.93% year over year. Now, remember, when we talk about that 1.47% number, that's the national average. But Western cities are outpacing owner expectations. In Denver, appraisal values were 2.98% higher than homeowners expected. Estimates from those in some of the eastern cities were higher than appraised values. This includes Philadelphia, where appraisals were 2.94% lower than homeowners estimated. Home values have been leveling off as the winter months carry forward, according to the National Home Value Index. The average appraisal dipped by a modest 0.34% from December to January. And that 1.47% number, I actually believe on average across the country is a little higher than it was the last time we talked about it. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was 1.2. The last time we talked about the discrepancy between what appraisers were expecting, or what homeowners were expecting, and what appraisers were delivering in terms of their appraisal amounts. Okay, and now on to a little discussion of buying vacant land. Now, let's talk about this for a second, because I'm all about trying to introduce you to alternate ways to achieve your goal that aren't like following every other rat in the maze. The bottom line is, if that house you're after is that piece of cheese, you're going to have to compete with a lot of other, maybe not rats, a lot of cute, fuzzy little mice to get your chompers on that chunk of cheese, right? So what if you could figure out a way to achieve that goal in a less conventional way that would get you what you want, get you there at a lower price, and you end up with nearly exactly the home you want, right? That sounds like a great combination. Now, if you've got the wherewithal to put up with the process, buying vacant land and building on it is a great way to do that. Now, this is a list that we're sharing from US News. It's not entirely accurate because some of the expectations they set do not represent my experience so far. And just to be clear, I have helped people purchase vacant land before, and I am in the process now of shopping for vacant land myself. I've made offers on a couple without being able to close a deal. But I'm in this process. I've already been pre-qualified for this. So I've gone through the first step, which should be, and your first step should not be find a piece of property. Your first step should be contact a lender who's going to be able to help you achieve this. And they mention this here in this article, but they do it in a way that I think will leave most people who read this thinking they're not going to do this. So once we get there, I'll point that out and make it super clear, because this is absolutely doable. And I don't want anyone being disappointed by what this article is going to say. So we'll go ahead and jump to their number one item, which is work with a pro who knows land. Now, we've talked about this before. You're going to want to work with someone who's familiar with land and some of the idiosyncrasies relating to land. It's a much smaller market. No agent is going to tell you that they don't know how to do land, but you're going to want to ask them, how many lots have you sold or bought over the last year for clients? Here's also a reality check for you. Nobody that I know in real estate focuses just on lots, at least not in this area. You just can't do it. Enough of them don't come up for you to build a robust business around it. So you're going to need to keep that in mind too. So you may have someone who has done some of these, but predominantly is doing some other brand of real estate, like standard residential real estate, that type of thing. Just because, and just to give you an idea, I currently have a search running for lots in a pretty wide area. And over the course of the last year, I think maybe 3 lots have come on, and 2 of those were within the last week, and they both sold within 3 days. That was a very weird situation. The price was amazing. I actually tried to get in on that one, and they had, by the time I called them, they were already expecting offers within the next 30 minutes, so I couldn't make their deadline. But that's the situation. The lots are very rare, and oftentimes you're going to find that lots have challenges to them that you may or may not want to deal with. We'll talk about that in a minute. So having someone who has some experience is going to be a valuable thing for you to do, or a valuable tool for you to have along with you for this ride. But I would say no matter what, buying a lot is one of those experiences where you need to really get out there and try to get as much knowledge as you can. Don't just rely on that real estate person. And with Google, you can do enough searching and get enough information where I think you can come up with a pretty good amount of data that can calibrate you to what your expectations should be, or at least some things you should be paying attention to. Number 2 on their list, and this is wrong, don't expect to get a loan. They go on to say a land purchase can't be leveraged with a bank the same way a home purchase can, so you'll likely have to pay cash if there's no structure on the property yet. An investor purchasing an apartment building, for example, might be able to put down 20% and get 80% from a bank, putting up the land and the building for a mortgage, says Larry Link, principal broker and president of Level Group in New York City. But if you have a piece of land, you might be lucky if a lender gives you 40% or 50% of the value, and that's typically if you have a good bank relationship or other collateral, you're more likely to get 0. Things may be completely different in New York. I'm not going to say that Larry Link in New York City is wrong given his local truth. So you'll want to figure this out. Again, my experience comes from right here in California. That is absolutely, completely, totally, 100% wrong. I had several options. When I very first started searching a year and a half ago, I had a couple of properties that looked good. I actually made offers on them. Didn't end up taking them because of what I discovered it would take to deal with flooding problems on those properties. But I had several options. I could either come up with 50%, which I didn't want to do, but I could. The other option was to get a construction loan that goes through phases. It handles the acquisition of the property. It handles the construction of the building, and then once it's completed, it turns into a regular conforming mortgage. Now, what's interesting about that, and I've discussed this on previous shows, most of you probably haven't heard it. I mean, the last time I think we talked about these specific loans was well over a year ago, maybe a year and a half. But one of the great venues or tools, lending tools that my lender was going to use with me was one where when you lock in the rate today to get this whole process started, that's the rate you get through the whole thing. When I first started talking to them 2 years ago, it wasn't like that. A rate would get calculated, I think, right from when construction ended. But now they had a product that would allow you to wrap the whole process together so that there was one lock-in for an interest rate and you're done. So if you're someone who's thinking interest rates are going to be going up in the near term over the next year, that would be obviously a bonus. I don't know if that product still exists, but my point is there are products out there that can help you achieve this goal. Next on their list, do consider the value of homes in the neighborhood. Absolutely. It would be absolutely moronic for you to not take into account what's going on in the neighborhood. In my particular case, where I'm tending to find these lots, there is no neighborhood. This is formerly farmland. One of the lots I looked at still had garlic growing on it. So there's no quote unquote neighborhood. So what do? You look at neighboring communities. What's right near it? Because you want to get calibrated to what's a reasonable development. And you know what? If you're the very first person to build on that street, you may be the one who defines what kind of building goes on that street. You'll need to figure out where you're going to go with that yourself. But the point is, if you overbuild, you're going to end up with a house you spend $1.5 million on that's only going to sell for $800,000 in that area, right? One of the biggest draws, according to them, and I'm quoting now, is building your home is the ability to customize it, but sure, you're building your dream home in a neighborhood with a similar taste. One person recalls working with a client who purchased land and designed a home only to be turned down for a construction loan because the cost of the land combined with the cost to build was about $2.2 million, significantly more than home values in the neighborhood, which were closer to 1.5. Yes, absolutely. You want to be calibrated because you don't want to go to the point where you're building something that just isn't supported by the market that you're building it in. That's not a very hard thing to do in general. If you go with averages for a community, if you realize you're in slightly upscale communities, if you go with streets that are a block or 2 or 3 away that do have homes on them and get calibrated to what those are selling for. But my argument is this, and my mindset's obviously a little bit different. I want to build a house where when it's done, I could turn around and sell it for a considerable profit. So that's what I'm shooting for. I'm not shooting for paying for a home that's barely worth what I paid to build it. The whole point of looking at this as an option, right? If you're someone who's out there shopping for a home, my suggestion is that doing it this way in many cases will give you what you want and do it for less. And one way to do that is to approach it from the construction side as well. Now, one way I've looked at going, you can get a modular home. I wouldn't get a manufactured homes. Manufactured homes are a different kind of a thing. When you list a home as a manufactured home, it's basically the new term for a mobile home, and that's not the direction you want to go. A modular home is simply a home where chunks of it were pre-assembled in a factory somewhere, right? It's basically a stick-built home, but just done in a modular fashion so that it's then brought together on the site. Manufactured homes are a completely different thing. A modular home, once it's done, it is a single-family residential home, indistinguishable from others. I have seen modular homes that have been built in exclusive multi-million-dollar neighborhoods up on the peninsula near Palo Alto, Los Altos Hills, and they are amazing. So, I don't have any kind of a stigma with modular homes, particularly since once it's done, once the paint's on the side of the house, once the mailbox goes up, I can list that as a single family residential home. And the only difference is that they tend to actually be built to a higher standard than what you'd get from a typical stick built home. There's absolute regularity there. Everything is built to specific requirements that tend to go above and beyond what the code requires. It's a great way to go. I've seen too many people use it who get great results to not back that idea up. I'm going to go ahead and suggest a website for you. Now, this is a website that tends to focus on California. If you go to their front page, you will find options which include, let me just take a quick look so I can mention them. It says to pick the section that best describes you. I have land in California today. I'm looking for land in California. or everyone else click here. So click one of those, whichever one you fall into, if this interests you at all, and get more information. Let them know who sent you. Hopefully they'll remember my name. They haven't talked to me in a while because I've been trying to make this happen for an awfully long time. But in any event, this is how I plan to go. If I can finally find that right piece of property that works, these are the folks I'm going to end up using. And I actually found the lender I'm talking to through this website. So feel free to reach out to these folks, contact them, see what they can do for you if you're someone in California. If you're not in California, see if they've got some great suggestions for you to potentially satisfy your needs in whatever state you're in. But again, this is math that you should be doing to make this process more advantageous for you. You can get the exact layout you want. It can be exactly the home you want. It doesn't mean that you have to end up paying some crazy amount that you would have ended up having to pay if you were bidding against other buyers buying a house. So just consider this as an option. Now let's go back. You know what? I'll even include a link to Cutting Edge Homes so that if you want to go check out the show notes for today's show, you can do that. Don't skip the survey or environmental tests. Now, this is one thing that an awful lot. A survey has to be done. I mean, you got to do it. All kinds of different things on a piece of land. But you're going to want to do all of these tests, all of this research in order to protect yourself. You just don't know what's been going on here. If in my case, it's obviously farmland. I don't know what it was used prior to that. You want to be as careful as you possibly can. So do your due diligence. And this is one of the things where a typical agent may not even think of suggesting to do. You're absolutely going to want to do a survey, particularly if this is a subdivided situation where what you've got is tons of farmland that's been cut up into several pieces. You want to get that initial survey done absolutely correct. So get a survey done, get an environmental test done. If you have to do a septic tank, you're going to have to do a perk test anyway. That's a percolation test, and it's a test to verify that the land will support a septic tank. Even better, though, and if you've got this option, try to buy a lot that has access to utilities. Don't just ask the seller if it has access to utilities. Let me give you a good example of why. I was looking at a lot, and they said that we've got access to power and we have access to gas, but you'll have to get septic and you'll have to get a well. Okay, thank you. I went and talked to the City Hall folks and discovered that while that was true, that only those two things came to the curb, there was a water main at the end of the street, which was only one lot down, and sewer one lot down. And I could bring that stuff to my house. And what you need to do is determine whether or not the expense of that is worth it to you. Now, it's going to change because the distance from those services is going to determine the cost. Sometimes they'll break it up by foot. You know, if you're 20 feet away, maybe it's $1,000 a foot. Maybe it's $5,000 a foot. You need to find that out for your area. But in some cases, the convenience of it, because in many cases, you'll find that if you just did a well or just did a septic system, would cost you less. It's going to be that rare situation where those two are a wash, where it's the same cost for each. But if you're close enough, it can absolutely be worth it. And I love the idea of getting one or both that way. Now, in this particular case, it was like, as I said, it wasn't that far. I didn't get a cost, but it was close enough. Someone ballparked it for me in the office, and it sounded reasonable. And adding it onto the cost of the overall development of the property made sense. It sounded like a good way to go. But here's the other part. As soon as you start introducing that kind of stuff, you introduce all kinds of problems in terms of red tape and getting things done. Whenever you're talking about the city or the county having to come out and do something on your lot, it's an issue. Now, in some cases, you can go ahead and start working on your property without that stuff being done. If there's electricity that already comes to the lot line, you're good. Dealing with a power utility historically, in cases I've worked with in the past, dealing with the folks from the power company has been actually pretty easy. It hasn't been that hard. I'm not sure it's going to be true in your region, but here, haven't really had a whole lot of problems with folks that I've worked with in the past who've needed to get power set up on site. at least if power was at the lot line, which in most of those cases it was. For those things when it needs to get moved, when you need to install a line, it can present other problems. The cost could be variable for a bunch of different reasons, and you'll have to look into that. So my suggestion is look at that as a bonus. Look at that as a frosting on the cake option if you feel that you're close enough. And in that case, I think I probably would have been to make it worthwhile. But also can kind of understand that you may find yourself in a position where once you actually end up running the numbers, it doesn't make sense. You don't want to do it, or you can only do one or the other, and be willing to settle for not having those things. Be willing to settle for just drilling a well and putting in a septic. One downside to a septic is you can't build anything on top of your leach field. So you lose that space. So you can't turn that into, a detached garage or a workshop or anything like that. That kind of stuff has to be separate. So you need to do this with a larger lot if you're interested in that kind of space. But these are things to think about before you move forward with any of these types of properties. Okay. Next, do take utilities and road access into account. This is a big one. And if you've got a road that is difficult to navigate, you have to decide whether or not you want to be navigating that every day to get home and every day to get out. You have to decide what utilities you absolutely must have in order for a lot to be something you're willing to live on. Without that up front, you're potentially going to get yourself into a situation where you are not going to get what you want. You're going to find yourself living someplace where you're miserable. Running water and electricity and sewers, they're awesome. And they're all assumed when you're buying an existing property, but that's not always assumed when you're looking at vacant lots. So make sure you're calibrated to what's there and what's not. One interesting thing that they mention here in this article is they say don't talk to the neighbors. I think I kind of agree with their take on this, but maybe not all the way. So what they say is, while speaking to neighbors when you're looking at a house may be a great idea to get a feel for the area, discussing your plans to build on a vacant lot with neighbors can easily lead to organized opposition to your future dream home. According to one expert, it's common for neighbors who are used to having a raw land lot near their home to get upset when the status quo is about to change and seek to keep you from building. All they're doing is gathering information to use against you, he says. Hold off on making friends with the neighbors until any home is built and you're moved in. Otherwise, discussing plans could lead to a neighbor dispute before you've even broken ground. I tend to agree with this one. I've got a couple of not firsthand, but secondhand clients I've worked with who made friends with folks during the survey of the property. And those folks got all upset and went and petitioned and tried to get the project stopped and all this other kind of stuff. Depending on where you are, that will or won't work to one degree or another. This happened to be in Santa Cruz County, where just about anyone and everyone who has an opinion about what you should do with your property gets a hearing. So it can really throw a wrench into the works and slow things down. Next on their list, don't assume you can have property rezoned. This is a huge one. You need to calibrate yourself to what the property is. You need to have a viable plan for using the lot as it currently exists. If you think that rezoning is absolutely must happen in order for you to move forward with what you want to do with the lot, then that needs to be part of the deal. I've had investors do this and rezone after. These were folks who had a long history of experience with getting properties rezoned. So I wouldn't suggest that be something you try to take on as a new investor. They describe this as your local governing body will have zones, codes, and ordinances that limit what can be built on any property or require certain steps to build a sound structure. There may be required setbacks from the edge of the property, mandates to build a seawall if you're on a waterfront, or a percentage of the land may be restricted from development. Getting an exception to the rule isn't easy, but there's a good chance it will be denied, according to these guys. I think that's absolutely true, and particularly here in California, I live in a state where if you're someone trying to do this, and I have a client who purchased a house with me about 4 years ago, in the Santa Cruz Mountains where he was doing all kinds of stuff to this basement. And it was just the amount of hoops he had to jump through. And he'd finally get to a point where he had reached some level of understanding with the building inspector. That building inspector retired. A new guy came on, and it was like starting all over again. So even if you feel like you've got yourself dialed in, don't put all of your plans on the shoulders of this theory that you can change things about the property, like rezoning, anything that's not under your control. And one other thing as a sideline to the rezoning discussion is really understanding what the codes and ordinance are that affect this property. What can or can't you do? Are there any state, county, or local ordinances that say you can't build on this property for a certain number of years? We have those kinds of things here in California where because of what a previous owner does, a lot cannot be built on for some period of time. Make sure you're aware of that stuff. Don't buy it without doing enough research so that you understand what the influences are. And be willing to ask those dumb questions. If it's within the city limits, go to City Hall and say, here is the lot I am looking at. If I wanted to start building on this lot tomorrow, what would need to happen? What do I need to have and have completed from you what's the process for me to start building a home on this lot? You're likely to find out an awful lot of things you didn't know about. You may even discover you're not actually within the city limits. You may discover you're within the county, not the city. So you have to go to the county seat and talk to those guys. So keep all of that stuff in mind. This is when it comes to lots, all of the work that you're going to do on the front end is so much more impactful, so much more important in terms of making sure you do it right so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you're stuck with a piece of property that you can't do anything with. Okay. Once again, folks, I hope I'm leaving you with far more value than the time that you spent listening to the show. I really do appreciate you choosing to spend time with me each and every day discussing these topics. Thanks again for listening, everybody. I'll talk to y'all next time.